Hey, I'm Taylor Dorsett, and this is the Professional Technical Interviewee. Technical interviews are hard, and every company does them differently. On this show, I interview engineering leaders to see what they look for in technical candidates, and then they perform a real technical interview with me. I hope you enjoy. Connor, Brendan, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here early on a Friday morning.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Well, to intro you both, you both work at LaunchPad Lab in engineering leadership roles. And Brendan, you've been around a number of years, but I think Connor, you've been there quite a while now yourself. And you both are involved heavily in the interview process, and I know have been interviewing a lot, and hiring a lot, or at least have a lot of open roles over the last 6 months or year or so. So excited to talk to you both and learn from your experience. Is there anything I missed? Anything else you want to bring up specifically from your background that you want to share with folks?
I would just say, we're also in manager coaching roles as well. So I think that is kind of a natural synergy to sort of look what we see makes people successful at Launchpad, kind of like post hiring, and try to evaluate that earlier in the interview process to make sure there's kind of a mutual fit. So I think that's been kind of helpful to see both perspectives, sort of pre-hiring and then kind of post-hiring the people that seem to enjoy Launchpad and are successful and kind of grow.
Yeah, that's interesting. I typically ask if people can share a little about what they do at the company, but that seems pretty important, and it's something I think a lot of companies put on the back burner, right? It's like, okay, now we've got someone in the door, at least they're here, right? We'll worry about making other hires rather than making sure it's actually a good fit and they're actually growing and happy, right? Other than a 90-day check-in. Right? Do you have specific things you do to try to accomplish that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the interview process, I think we try to sort of evaluate or get a sense of the candidate from a cultural perspective, a day in the life of someone at Launchpad, how would they kind of excel in that role? I think Launchpad being a consultancy and in general, us having relatively small project teams, technical team members are asked to be client facing and be good at communicating. So we try to sort of emphasize that or understand a little bit better someone's prior experience on that. And just see, some people are more comfortable with that than others. It's not necessarily wrong that someone has less experience with that or less interest in that. It's just trying to evaluate what we've seen be successful on project work. And then I think, in terms of the sort of technical challenge, and, maybe we'll get to this a little bit later, we try to structure it a little bit like a consulting engagement, like a very sort of scaled down, because obviously it's, there's not enough time sort of thing. But I think we try to sort of mimic a little bit of that ambiguity developers will tend to have to deal with. It's not necessarily hard and fast technical requirements. It's more sort of product requirements driven. So I think that kind of helps. If someone sort of excels and enjoys that type of challenge, they'll probably enjoy the project-based work we do.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Could you both share a little bit about your pathway into technology? What your first kind of tech job was and how you got into that? Maybe Connor, you could kick us off.
Yeah, sure. I started out building websites in middle school and high school. I was using Dreamweaver at the time, drag and drop, really simple. And when I went to university, I decided to go with mechanical engineering and sort of step away from the coding a bit. And as I progressed through that, I realized that the only assignments that I really enjoyed were the ones that involved programming. So sort of thinking about that, and ended up getting a job as a tech consultant and working primarily with an insurance platform called Guidewire, which allowed me to do a little bit of coding, a little bit of configuration, and also just working with and managing other developers. And that really kickstarted me, or influenced me to think about what it would look to fully transition into a developer role. And so I ended up going to a boot camp in Chicago, and then got a job at LaunchPad.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah, I've heard that similar story, right? Especially it's STEM adjacent, right? Like type of career paths where you do a little bit, you like the one or two like coding class, and you go, oh, maybe I actually want to do this instead. Right.
Yeah,
That's
but it's
great.
like the fourth year of
Yeah.
of college, and you can't afford to stay any longer. So yeah.
Totally. Brendan, how about yourself?
Yeah, I kind of share some similar elements to what Connor mentioned. I mean, I did it in engineering degree as well. I did electrical in college, but kind of always interested in coding in high school. Like I took a C++ random class, knowing that that would probably be relevant to engineering. But it is interesting. Maybe this is a departure from what Connor was saying. Like for the CS, like computer science courses I took, like I really didn't like them in college. I like struggled with it. Maybe that's why I didn't like it. So I kind of, I don't know, like felt like that was kind of what, software development was. Senior year, we had like a like capstone project, and I built a little website for it in Dreamweaver. So I was like, oh, well, that was kind of fun, more of a visual element to coding that wasn't really present in like the CS classes. Then I did kind of a manufacturing engineering role for a couple of years, and then got interested in some of the boot camps. And that's kind of what like catapulted me more into tech, and learning to code. And then in terms of career path, like actually like co-founded LaunchPad coming out of that boot camp. So the only tech job I've had is at this company. But yeah, I think the like web development world of like software engineering, that's like the right like blend for me of um, hardcore like technical engineering problems, but also kind of the visual user experience kind of product layer that I think maybe in those CS courses, looking back on it, like that was kind of missing. So I think for me and kind of the way my brain works, like that part really is like exciting to see all the technical work sort of roll up to this like visual output that you kind of can see a user connect with. I think that's what kind of really like, uh, sort of like inspirational to me.
Yeah. It felt like 5 to 10-ish years ago, there was kind of a gap in computer science programs where what you're describing was happening, right? A lot of people are like, great, I get this computer science fundamentals, but I don't actually know how to code, right? Like I'm not actually building projects other than maybe one senior level course where they say, great, build something, right? And everything else was like, I'm just learning data structures and algorithms, right? Versus I think boot camps came around to try to solve the problems. You might not have any of that other stuff. Right, but you're gonna have these. You're gonna have a project at the end. You're gonna actually know how to write CRUD apps, right? It's kind of an interesting shift, and I think computer science programs have adjusted a lot to actually try to implement more of that. Well, I guess it depends on the program, but it's definitely been a shift. I'm really curious about the decision to kind of build Launchpad right out of that boot camp because it's definitely if I was coming out of the boot camp, I don't think I would have been confident enough in my abilities to be like, yeah, let's go for this. So I'm curious if you could share a little about that, Brendan.
Yeah, it's one of those things like, I don't think we stood there kind of at the end of the boot camp like, oh, I'll be building, Launchpad 10 years from now or something like that, like we are now. But I think it just, starts kind of small in the sense of like the boot camp I was in was, learning, Ruby on Rails. But at the end of it, there's kind of this demo day. You're going to build something and showcase it. And that's that project I work on is actually where I met one of the other co-founders of Launchpad. And then my mentor at the bootcamp I was at was the third co-founder at Launchpad. So it started kind of small in the sense of like, hey, we like building stuff together. We're kind of in this, budding sort of tech industry in Chicago in terms of like a startup scene. People need stuff built. We'd love to keep learning and like maybe kind of make some like more or less like freelance income, if that makes sense. While also being able to kind of like hack on our side projects and that we worked on during the boot camp. So it started kind of just like, wanting to like just keep going coding, and like client projects sort of gave us a great outlet for that, where it's like, hey, this is kind of stepping up in terms of like professionalism and like you're getting paid for this, paid for this work. And then I think it just, as we kept doing more and more projects, like, oh, this like diversity of projects is really interesting. And then you're like, oh, well, now we're getting more projects than we can handle, the three of us. You need to expand the team. So I think it was kind of just like that, 6 to 12 month period after the boot camp. It was like, is this, truly the right fit? Because the boot camp's, 3 months, you're making a career shift. You never know if it's like, oh, well, it was fun for a couple of months, but now I realize it's difficult. So yeah, I don't know if there's always like a grand vision in the sense of like, this is what it'll look like 10 years from now. I think it was more of just like, this is enjoyable. Let's keep going from there. And then, kind of once you build that momentum with other team members, I think then you kind of start to establish more of that like mission and vision and the things that kind of define Launchpad as it is now. But I don't know if early on it was like that clear in our minds.
Sure, so a little more organic. I like that. I
Yeah.
mean, maybe that makes it less daunting than saying we're going to do this. We're all on board for the next 10 years. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the mindset, I mean, not that this is about necessarily like founding companies per se, but I think it's just like the best way to kind of learn or make progress is like just try the next thing and make the next thing be kind of a smallish commitment and just kind of iterate and be agile about it in the sense of like how you establish like in the eyes of a company like what you want to be. It doesn't have to be like I have all that clarity. I mean, sometimes people get interviewed right when the company's been around for 5, 10 years, and it seems like, oh yeah, well they knew all this day one. It's like, probably not.
Yeah.
They iteratively got there, but you have to kind of like take those steps, right? Versus like if you get too much into like overthinking it, if that makes sense, and like, oh, why? I don't want to pick a direction. It's like, well, pick one. It can't be that wrong. And if you don't like it, you can go the other one.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now that I'm thinking about it, Home Chef, where I work now, is actually, I believe, started out of a boot camp as well. Patrick, our founder, went to a coding boot camp and then basically had the idea and then kind of kept building on it, and it grew and grew and grew. Which I'm sure he wasn't thinking, let's build this big company as well. So it's interesting. Cool. And have y'all been actively interviewing at Launchpad recently here for new hires?
Yeah, we've been pretty active on the hiring front. Across a couple different roles. Typically specialize in like Rails and React development. So those are kind of the two most common skill sets. We also do a decent amount like Salesforce development. So we've kind of sort of adapted our hiring process and the technical interviews in particular to sort of try to meet the candidate where their skill sets are.
Could you share a little bit about the part of the interview process you typically handle? Maybe Connor, you could go first. I know sometimes people are like, oh, I only do the intro call, but other people do the technical, and that looks like.
Yeah, it depends on the role. So there are roles or positions that I've played more of like the hiring manager role for, doing not necessarily the initial screening, but maybe the first call, and then supporting them throughout the process there. I've also done quite a bit of technical interviewing, and that happens during our sort of final stage that we have. And then I do a bit of cross-functional interviewing, and that's more like behavioral style interviews mostly for like other departments. So I'll jump onto an interview for a product manager or maybe a designer. But yeah, I mean, I'd say that pretty much every stage except maybe the very initial resume screening, I'm fairly familiar with.
Nice. And how about yourself, Brandon?
Yeah, I would say, I've played a couple different roles, the same way like Connor described. I would say most commonly I'm on the technical interviews. But, one thing we try to do, I think, is, get more, particularly in the technical interview, more current Launchpad team members involved in that process. So within the technical interview, usually there's like kind of a lead on the Launchpad side that's like, handling intros and kind of maybe guiding the candidate through the technical challenge, while another developer is kind of there to ask questions and sort of shadow. But ultimately, like we kind of want that person that's shadowing to eventually like take the lead. So, I probably have been trending to like be on less technical interviews to kind of like give that opportunity to more team members. But when I do tend to participate, it's usually in that technical portion.
Yeah, great. Can you all share a little bit about what you're typically evaluating for in those interviews? Obviously, technical skills are important, right? Connor, you mentioned it kind of depends on the interview or the type of role and where you are in the process. But can you share a little about what you're looking for or what you're trying to get out of those interviews?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to the technical interview first. We, as Brendan mentioned earlier, we try and make the prompt realistic, and so like really what we're trying to get an understanding of is what would it be like to work with this person.
Mm.
I wouldn't say it's not like it's not totally like a pair programming exercise where it's still mostly meant to be driven by the candidate. But yeah, like we want to hear their thought process, and especially when it comes to like product decisions. I think Brendan mentioned this earlier too. Like we work on pretty small teams, and those teams are whatever your role is, you're involved in the product from pretty much the beginning, and expected to come to the table with an opinion. And so it's not just about the code that they write or the way they structure it. It's what how they choose to display it, or other decisions that they make that are more like user focused, or product focused. And so ultimately, we're looking for someone that has the ability to communicate their thoughts, and think about more than just the code that they're writing. And from a behavioral standpoint, or we have a set of constants or values that we've defined, and we pretty much use those as sort of our uh, you like evaluation criteria for if they'd be a good fit, good person to work with.
Interesting. I love that idea of being like having a product focus, especially in a consulting role, because I've been in both types of roles in the past where like I was, in charge of all the product decisions. We didn't really have a product manager at all. And then my role now, we have a really great product manager, but I definitely do less of that, right? Because a lot of this is kind of prescribed for us and we have such a defined brand internally. There's definitely pluses and minuses to being in both those spots, but I could see it's important if that's a big part of the role to actually get that out up front, right? And to figure out, does someone like this or not? Because some people may hate that, right? And I don't want to do that at all. I just want them to tell me exactly what to build. I'll build it and then I'll not worry about it anymore, right? Versus like, I love this. And if someone told me everything I had to do, I'd be bored out of my mind, right? That's really interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. And, we definitely have product managers today. But, 5, 6 years ago, when Launchpad was sort of founded, um, there weren't product managers. Like the developers were playing that role. So a little bit of it is influenced by just the historical nature of Launchpad. But even though we do have product managers now, because we have realized that it's just too much for one person to take on. I think we found that was having developers that have that sort of mindset and have that like entrepreneurial attitude, was sort of one of the unique aspects of Launchpad and what made them successful. And so we want to make sure that we don't lose that.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and I think there's always levels to that, right? Some people are like, I'm fine making some amount of decisions, right? As long as I'm not making all of them, right? And other people are like, I don't want to make any, right? So you gotta have at least a little of that, I think, to be successful at probably really any consulting role. I think there's maybe some really large consulting companies where you're just building one tiny piece of something and maybe it's all described for you. But I think a lot of roles you're making more of those decisions, or at least talking with customers, helping them decide what what direction they should go, right? I think that's often a big part of it too, where they don't even necessarily know. So you're coming in with, at least I have an opinion, and then we can try to work towards something that we both agree on from there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one thing you mentioned earlier, what we look for in the technical interview, and I think it's not like a disqualifier or something like that, but I'm always encouraged when candidates sort of speak through trade-offs that they're making. I mean, it's a time box challenge. They're probably not going to write the greatest code ever, but they're like, hey, I'm going to write it this way. Usually I would kind of refactor it in this way if I had more time. Like, I think that's always really helpful perspective. And that's in kind of a technical lens, but I think ultimately they're being able to articulate trade-offs. And I think that kind of goes to what you just mentioned, Taylor. Like with a client, it's not so much like that the developer needs to make the decision, but sometimes they need to sort of present options and trade-offs and help the like client or like the product management team at Launchpad like sort of narrow in on an option, because sometimes it might not be clear what the trade-offs are, kind of from like an engineering layer perspective. So I think that's again, not necessarily something that's like a disqualifier if someone like doesn't articulate that, but it is encouraging when they do tend to do that because it usually translates pretty well on a client project. They can say, okay, well, if we do this arrangement, like that's going to be more robust for the future, but it's going to add like development costs, X, Y, and Z, that kind of stuff. They tend to be like a little bit more comfortable articulating that to clients.
Yeah. I'm curious about the client facing piece. Are you mostly screening for that and like the behavioral interview just to make sure that like someone who's able to effectively communicate and that you feel comfortable communicating with, or do you have like a specific exercise or anything you do with folks to make sure that they would be good in some type of role where they're speaking with clients on a regular basis?
I think we get, yeah, I do think we get most of that out of the behavioral interview. There's, we might ask like specific questions about, and tell us about an example of a time that you had conflict with someone, or you had to convince someone that your approach was the right one to go down, to sort of get at that. But a lot of it is just in how the conversation itself goes. And then in the technical portion, there is a little bit of communication skills that we're testing, just in terms of like their ability to talk, sort of speak their thought process out loud and work together with the interviewers. And there have been candidates that sort of sit there and code for 20 minutes, and like that's not necessarily a disqualifier, but it doesn't it's not a strong signal for like their ability to really be open and client facing.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I do some mock interviews and I'm always telling people, even if you need some time to think, just tell people up front, hey, I need a couple of minutes to think, right? And then before I decide what I'm going to do next. And even that lets me know, okay, great, you're thinking, rather than are you thinking, are you stuck, are you just silently staring? Like I don't really know. So even something that small I think helps a lot with that process. uh could one of you walk me through the actual steps of the process? I'm assuming it's some type of resume screen or phone call first, and then maybe a conversation with a manager. Could you talk through the actual steps?
Yeah, sure. I think, say like our typical process, and this is speaking for the more so the engineering department, would be having a resume screen, and then a 15 to 30-minute call with whoever sort of playing the role of hiring manager, and then pending their decision, if the candidate moves on, it'd go into like our quote unquote final round, and that consists of a usually like a 1 hour technical interview and then a 30 to 45-minute behavioral interview.
Great. And then some decisions made after that, if offer or not for candidates.
Yeah, that's right. We try and keep it pretty condensed, because like, frankly, that's an advantage that we have over larger companies. Like we can make decisions really quickly. And we can also, see candidates really quickly to try and get that decision out the door. Yeah, it's worked pretty well so far.
Yeah. Coming from a recruiting background, speed is, or momentum is probably a better word than speed, is often the can be the killer or the success of any like interview process, right? When someone's really excited, they just got done with their final, and then they hear nothing for 7 days. Ooh, that's tough. They already forgot, right? Unless they really, really love the company. But if you can give them an answer within 48 hours or 72 hours, and it's like, oh, okay, this is still top of mind, right? I'm still excited about meeting Conor and Britton the other day on this call, right? It can be huge. Uh, so I know you both primarily have kind of worked at Launchpad, but in the past, when you've been the interviewee, right? Interviewing for some type of role. How do you feel you've done in technicals? You feel like you smashed them, you did really poorly, somewhere in between? Depends on the role. If either of you can shed some light on that.
I am not a great interviewee. I definitely don't do well like under pressure. So actually, when I interviewed with Launchpad, the technical evaluation was like a take-home challenge, which is definitely suits my sort of personality a lot better. But yeah, you like whiteboarding challenges, I usually just forget everything I've ever learned, and even including my name.
Yeah, I'm not all that dissimilar. I feel like, yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky. There's the balance of trying to respect individuals' times, and in our process, and other companies they might be interviewing with, a take-home challenge can be a burden, even in spite of like efforts to simplify. It's we can't control how much time someone takes, and they're trying to show their best work. But I would say for me personally, like thinking kind of under pressure, while someone's watching, even if it's like, hey, I need 5 minutes to think, like it's still tough. I would say like one of the things like we've tried to do is, have different like formats of the technical challenge. Like if someone express interest in a take home option, like we could facilitate that. It's not sort of the default
Mm.
that we go with, but yeah, I think it's if someone is looking at interviewing options, I feel like it's a fair question to ask of the company. Like, are there different arrangements that you could accommodate? They might say no, but it's probably worth asking at least. I think another thing, between a take-home challenge and a live exercise is maybe bringing in some sample code you've written and talking through it.
Mm.
I did that for one of my uh, technical interviews kind of back in the day, and that felt like a nice hybrid of like I had to think on my feet a little bit, but at least it was something that I kind of knew and could kind of speak through. So that's a format we've done at Launchpad at times, but that's also can be tricky too because sometimes people's quote unquote best work is sort of proprietary at their company and they like can't show it for like sort of IP reasons. So sometimes it's not that option like doesn't always work. But for me personally, it felt like kind of a nice like hybrid of got to think on your feet a little bit because people could ask you questions on like how to make this code better. But you have a little bit of something like, yeah, I kind of know this uh, code outside of just like a very narrow, like hour-long challenge per se.
Yeah, project like bringing in a project can be tough sometimes. I think it's great if people have those, right? Like I like the idea of having options. I was talking to someone yesterday, and they're like, "Have you done any worked on any projects recently?" And I was like, "Well, I host a podcast, but like I can't really show you. It's not a code base, right? I got 40 episodes with some technical challenges, but I can't really walk you through a CRUD app that I built, right? Like it's very different than that, but it's still technical in nature. But I do love the idea. Like, I think in an ideal world, a recruiting process, you have a in-person option for people who love that, a take-home option for people who like, I need time and I just want to work on this alone. And maybe, here's a project because I'm a person who really loves building projects and talking about my code. But it's just, I think, so hard to figure out, okay, can we even facilitate that and also be able to evaluate all of those people at the same grade, right? Like
Yeah.
if we have these three different things, are we giving them all equal grades?
Yeah, it's like an
You know,
equity issue. Yeah,
totally.
in the sense of two candidates for the same role, they had different challenges.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think again, it's sort of a kind of up to the discretion of the company because I think they have to enforce that equity and
Mm.
consistency so someone isn't inadvertently getting kind of like preferential treatment or something like that where
Yeah.
one candidate decided to ask for the take homes, they did that. The other candidate didn't, even though they would have done better if they had, and that's not like totally fair. So, yeah, I think we like kind of have those at our disposal, those options. And maybe for certain like hiring roles, we like maybe just like lean into like the default is going to be a code walkthrough, or you kind of like say for all these candidates. Uh, but yeah, I think we're pretty cautious within a like hiring role to be too diverse in like the amount of like technical challenges we'll do, given kind of like you said, it's pretty hard to evaluate consistently and like equitably across different candidates.
Yeah. It's hard if you only have one, let alone multiple different options, right? Now, do y'all have any advice for folks who are prepping for interviews? Maybe they got a job search coming up, but they're thinking, okay, in January, maybe everything will go back to normal a little bit, and I'm ready to start a new job. Any advice for folks who are prepping right now?
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head earlier, talking specifically about sort of like live in-person challenges or whiteboarding, in that even if you need to think, like ask for that time to think, or tell them like, I'm going to take a minute to just get a lay of the land here, and then we'll dive into it. And to, really sort of practice um, thinking out loud, because it's awkward at first and feels a little weird. Like it's not something that you do on a day-to-day basis. So that's one thing. And then like, related to that, but in a different format, would be for take-home challenges. Like spend a good amount of time on the README, document your thoughts. If you, even if you don't get to a requirement, or, if it's a time challenge, you run out of time, like in your README, talk about what you would have done, or in your README, talk about other features you'd like to add, or a potential roadmap in the future. Someone submitting a README in their take-home challenge, and like a well-documented README, maybe it's because we're a consultancy, but it like really stands out to me.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I think it's hard. Yeah, like in the technical interviews, like I think if something isn't said, kind of the default assumption is like it wasn't said because someone didn't realize it, or they like don't know it, if that makes sense. Like I think you can give the benefit of the doubt, so to speak, but in the absence of something being explicitly articulated, I think more often than not, you kind of have to assume that like someone doesn't understand that, or didn't recognize that. So if someone can be a little bit more like verbose in their communication, either in a README or their thought process, like I'm thinking through these three options. This one feels kind of wrong. This one feels, just right. It kind of, I think, sort of exposes to the interviewer more of the depth of someone's like thought process and understanding, because they can't like maybe like do all three options, say, here's how I would have done all three. There's just not enough time. If they can at least cite what they could have done if they had more time, again, either in a README or just talking through it, I think that like showcases like a greater offering of the candidate, or like gives a better representation of like everything they could bring to the table, as opposed to like, well, literally like I can only type so fast, or I can only like, have so much time to take home. So like I can't code everything up. So I think that's another thing to kind of build upon what Conor was saying.
Yeah. That's really helpful. I recently have seen even in like these like time technicals, like a hacker rank or some type of like exercise that someone will give, people adding comments in there where like, hey, I had a brute force solution, but no, I've only got 3 minutes left. This is how I would refactor this, right? And basically just almost pseudocoding out that approach, right? And say, I wasn't able to implement that, but that's what I would do if I had more time, and I could probably work through this, and seeing some success with that. And that's really interesting to me, of like, at least like you've described the approach, which in theory, if we're engineers and we can describe an approach, we could probably figure out how to work to that approach given enough time, right? Or given enough resources. So even just calling it out, it might seem silly to be like, well, all I did was write inline comments saying this is what I would do if I had more time. But just that, as an interviewer or someone evaluating that, I go, okay, great. Well, I know you got at least this brute force thing, right? That you could get through something. And then you've described an approach that you could implement. Okay. Well, I'm not going to give you full credit for actually implementing that, but at least half, right? Like partial credit for this. Like you're thinking through this, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it goes back to like, I think irrespective of a consulting or product company, like I would say it's pretty rare for developers to like kind of have like a timed coding experience, in the sense of like in your day-to-day job, like you're usually not like staring at a clock, like you have 30 minutes to implement this feature. I would say there's a velocity aspect to agile and like output, but usually there's, people get in flow, and they come out of flow, and there's just those ebbs in terms of productivity. But then in this like interview, in a technical challenge, it's like you better be like on point for this 1 hour and kind of nail it. Like it is a very artificial experience. It's just sort of a necessary evil in terms of scheduling and that sort of stuff. So yeah, anything they can kind of do to like break that barrier by like giving that pseudocode, I think helps almost like bring it back to reality, where like, yeah, like in reality, they would probably have to talk out this feature with a teammate. It's probably how it actually worked, as opposed to, developers work in isolation just kind of know all the answers off the top of their head within a very short time window. Like it's probably not the most realistic like coding day-to-day experience.
Yeah. Do you have any additional advice or different advice for early career folks? Maybe this is their first job search out of a boot camp or their second job search.
I mean, I know we mentioned this earlier about like the code sample thing. I would say that, you know, for folks coming out of a boot camp, like not necessarily having a portfolio, but like trying to build lots of different stuff or like hack on stuff, I think just gets kind of the juices flowing and puts someone in the right headspace. Potentially those could even be used as like, you know, a resume submission, so to speak, beyond just kind of like dropping a PDF. Because ultimately the resume itself, right, just from a pure like reading the stats will not probably show much experience on paper. And for some companies that could be like that could be an easy way to screen early or developers early in their career out. So the way I think you can kind of control that or influence that as someone like coming out of a boot camp or just being early in their career is like trying to build up your portfolio. And it doesn't mean like you have to have all these live professional sites, but just like things you've worked on. Because like that's yours, like no one can take that away. And maybe it helps complement a like resume that doesn't have like listed years of experience in a developer role. Cause that's just, I mean, all of us were at some point in our career, like we didn't have any experience, right? Because eventually, you know, you have always that first job. So I think trying to sort of build that out or make that like easily accessible, maybe even included in like a resume drop, I think is probably a good thing. Whether or not the company looks at it, you know, can't really control that, but at least you kind of like, that's the thing a candidate could control and influence. And I'd imagine for maybe like hopefully the right company that would be a good fit for that person, like they would like look at that like GitHub profile and be like encouraged by that. Like, oh, there's a lot of activity here. I see they're like trying out new technologies, or I can see them kind of iterating on this, you know, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. When I was first coming out of a boot camp, I had a project that I felt like looked nice, at least. Whenever I could, if I was on a call like this with the manager, I'd be like, "Oh, let me show you my project," and I would like screen share and like pull the thing up. Or if I was on a phone call, I'd be like, "Here's the URL. Like, type this in, please. Like, at least go look at it." Because I felt like it at least made an impression from like. It's easier to read something on a resume. Okay, I understand the project. But if you actually see something, then you're putting like a visual to that. And you go, okay, well, maybe you mess around with it a little bit. Could be good if it's good, maybe not good if it's not a great project, but at least you've like shown your ability to do something. And I always encourage people to like get stuff live and easily accessible, so you can send someone a link and say click on this, right, and like see what I've actually done, instead of just, even GitHub is nice, you can see the lines of code, but it's not easy to like conceptualize what is this actually doing, right?
Yeah.
I feel like that's helpful to connect with people.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times you know, Conor and myself came out of boot camps, like there was that like demo day, there was that capstone project where, you know, hopefully, you know, you kind of have that portfolio almost by default in a way, or at least like one piece in your portfolio, versus like, oh, I have to like think of it, like think of all this stuff to build. Like usually within like these boot camp programs, like there's usually something you're kind of building throughout, or you like do like a hack weekend or something like that, and like, you know, those are your portfolio pieces to start with. So maybe for folks that are in a boot camp and maybe, I don't know, the hack sessions are more optional, or, you know, they're kind of presented that way. Like I would, you know, I'd encourage folks to like take advantage of those, because those could quickly become your portfolio pieces that will become helpful to like showcase in an interview, or just make you more comfortable talking through a technical challenge, if that makes sense, because you just have more reps. So yeah, anytime there's a chance to like produce some app, you know, in your boot camp, I would say like seize that opportunity, because like then that's kind of yours to take with you in the future, to use as, you know, rounding out your resume for interviews.
Great. Before we take a break here and move into the technical portion, any interviewing horror stories that y'all are willing to share, where you can say, well, you know, if Conor or Brendan went through this and they're successful in their career, you know, maybe I can do it too. It's not so bad.
Yeah, I mean, there's one interview that I remember where it started out as a, I think it was a 20-minute phone call or something like that. It started out as just a behavioral, like get to know you phone call. And then sort of unbeknownst to me, I was asked a question that it was sort of like an algorithm. It had an algorithm answer, but it was phrased it's something about like dropping eggs from a building, and how would you tell when the egg would break, or what floor the egg would break on. And I bombed the question so badly. Like I didn't understand what they were looking for. Like after I gave the answer, the interviewer was like, "Are you sure that's your answer?" And at that point, I was just like, "Yeah." And yeah, I mean, I think that like the reality is you're going to bomb interviews. Some interviews are not going to go well, and like just brush it off and move forward. And ideally, like at Launchpad, we try and like very clearly communicate like what to expect from each interview, so that at the very least, like there's not this like, here's a surprise technical problem that you need to solve for us. And some of that is definitely influenced by my own experience, particularly related to that interview. But even then, it might just not be your day. Something else is going on in your life that distracts you, or you're not super comfortable working with English as a second language with so much pressure on you, and you don't do well, and that's totally okay. And I think especially Launchpad, like for us, it's very rare, if ever, that we have a candidate that we sort of assign like a never to. Like it's usually just like a not now. And so even if someone shows up and doesn't have their best day, that doesn't preclude them from applying a few months down the line and for us reconsidering them.
That's great. Yeah, I feel like the industry's moved a little bit away from like the technical riddle style questions. I haven't seen those as much anymore, but the old like how many piano tuners are there in Chicago or New York, right? Like how many golf balls can fit on a plane, like those types of, I feel like that was very common years ago. And I'm sure it's still out there, right? Not the most fun questions to get asked.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have like horror stories per se, but I think it's kind of you can kind of feel this, I think, after being in a number of interviews, is like the candidate is kind of trying to figure something out, and they're getting in their head about it, and they're like, should I ask for help? But maybe I'll figure this out. And you can kind of see them like kind of maybe getting overwhelmed by the moment. And I think the Connor's point, just kind of recognizing that like maybe you're really excited to try to work at this company, but like there are other companies out there. Maybe there's a chance to try again in the future. Like don't feel like it's like all or nothing in this moment. And with that mindset, I feel like, the thing I would kind of advise people is like, again, just try to articulate like where your head's at. It could be like I don't know, golf ball one, or piano tuner. You could just be like, okay, like the thing that I'm like really thinking through and kind of struggling with right now is X, Y, and Z. And just like keep talking, because I think at least for like Launchpad's interview style, I think we would prefer to like kind of nudge a candidate back on course to just keep them going versus like just letting them kind of, for lack of a better word, like drown, just like, well, save yourself kind of thing. Because I think, again, we know as a sort of a timed interview, it's kind of a strange construct in general. So if we can just kind of nudge someone back on track and just allow them to kind of continue in their flow, like I'd rather see that than just like kind of let them get stuck. But if they're not really articulating their thoughts, I think there's a hesitancy on the interviewer's part, because then it feels like we're kind of giving them the answer and they're not kind of meeting us closer. So again, maybe that's more of just like Launchpad style, and other, interview styles are a little bit more guarded, and they're like, prove to me that, you can solve this on your own. I'm not going to help you. Just kind of using those like mind games. But maybe that's a signal that the company isn't the one you want to work for. I don't know. But again, I think if someone is articulating kind of where they're getting stuck, or it can be easier for the interviewer if they have the mindset of like hoping them to say, have you considered blank, in a very indirect way, but it's just enough of a suggestion to get someone back on track, versus like the answer is, or you need to do blank. So I think that's probably a little bit too much of like leading the witness, and kind of maybe like breaks down kind of the equity thing, because now you're sort of, really pushing a candidate, as opposed to kind of just those like little course corrections, little nudges that help someone kind of reestablish confidence and kind of gets them back into like what they know.
Yeah, great. And I think that's super helpful. Good thing to keep in mind when you're on a downward spiral in an interview, right? Is like you can say, "Hey, I'm struggling with this kind, or this is what I can't figure out." Right? What do you think? Or literally just asking your interviewer a question. Sometimes it feels like, oh, I'm cheating, but like if it was like most interviewers given watching you flounder in silence for 20 minutes, or you saying, I don't know how to do this, and asking a question, they're probably gonna prefer like you asking the question, because then you're both just not sitting there wondering what's going on. Great. Well, then let's take a break here, then we come back, we'll move into the technical portion. Thank you for watching the first half of the Professional Technical Interviewee. The technical interview will be released 1 week from this episode, so be sure to subscribe to make sure you don't miss it. New episodes are released on the first 4 Thursdays of each month. Find us on YouTube at youtube.com/Taylor Dorsett, or on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes. And remember, keep practicing.